Good afternoon, Frank.
Good afternoon,
Um,
Professor Spooner.
it's been a couple of weeks since we talked last,
Technical
and
difficulties.
the world has not been slowing down. In fact, it seems to me that the main events since we talked last all seem to show some sort of resistance to globalization, and that's what also is getting reported in the media. It's interesting that a lot of things seem to have started with the Brexit vote in England in June, and then to somehow have speeded up with the American election. Uh, and all these things keep happening which nobody expects, but when they happen, it seems to be because people who normally didn't get a voice or weren't listened to, or who haven't been, nobody's been paying attention to them, are now able to voice their opinions, and their opinions go against what is generally expected, and it seems to be reversing the process. What do you think?
Well, do you really think it's reversing the process? I mean, this is
Well, we have to wait and see what happens in. I mean, it's not. I don't believe it's reversing the process in the long term,
exactly.
but I think that it's changing the way things are going to happen in the, at least in the medium term.
Yeah.
Now, of course, we're waiting to see what's going to happen in the spring with the French election,
Mm-hmm.
and also what's going to happen in Germany a little later, because Merkel seems to be changing her position on immigrants, presumably with her eye on the election, because unlike Hollande, she said she wants to run again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of things are suddenly very unclear instead of, I mean, I think up until June, we were expecting everything to continue to move at a recognizable speed towards greater and greater integration. And now these things keep happening that we weren't expecting, and people are adapting to it, and it's not clear quite what's going to happen next.
I, I agree with everything you observed. That's all correct. I do think, though, that the current process of globalization is so inevitable that there's no one man, one election, one country that can stand in its way. And I'd further submit that as we have begun to see sprouting in Britain since the election, a bit of a retrenchment coming back toward the center from just about everybody, except for people like Mr. Farage and really hardcore people. I think that the so-called billionaire cabinet that President-elect Trump is assembling, I think are well aware of what side their bread is buttered on. And when things begin to become ready to be decided upon, it's inconceivable to me that they're going to do anything other than continue to advocate free market economies.
And I think you're exactly right that the process of globalization is unstoppable. But there's a lot of things that can be done that will alter the way that it's working. And I think that the main problem with globalization so far has been political.
Yes.
That we have no idea how globalization is going to work politically. And I've been saying for some time that I think we're living now at the end of the age of the nation state, but we've no idea what's going to replace it. And the European Union was one idea of how to replace it, although it was never expressed quite in that way. But the European Union has been in a total mess for nearly a decade now, and it's in a bigger mess since the Brexit vote. And the Italian referendum hasn't helped.
No.
And nobody has yet suggested any way to fix the European Union, even though they've had summits but nothing has come out that sounds in any way like a new idea. And I mean, the most interesting thing for me is to try to work out what everyday social life is going to be like when we all have so many relationships that our whole idea of what it's like to have a relationship with somebody else is going to be diluted.
Yes.
In the same way that a family was a very definite social unit 50 years ago, and now it's you make your own, work out what exactly the sort of relationship you think you would like.
Well, I think that's a good observation, because I think we often talk on these broadcasts about the failures of institutions to be able to keep up speed-wise with the pace of change, and I think, for example, that the election of Trump in the United States is an embodiment of just that failure, and I furthermore am struck with a fear that what he is going to do, because of his cavalierness and perhaps outright ignorance and lack of respect for institutions as a whole, is going to essentially begin to govern by Twitter polling, putting proposals out there, giving the American populace 48 hours to respond, and then add up the votes on his Twitter account, and that's the way he's going to go. Now, before I fainted with horror over this, I began to think about this, and I began to think, well, maybe within this are the seeds of some better way for people to express themselves, and some better way for people to begin to gain a greater measure of control over their governments in this speed era of globalization. And if this was done properly, I mean, it would almost be like the referendum of the week kind of thing. And if it was done properly, supervised by the government, I mean, maybe we're looking at the future right in front of us and just can't see it.
The problem is, who are we talking to? We know how to talk to a small group of people who've come to meet us. We know how to talk to an audience that we can face. But when you're talking on Twitter, who are you talking to? And so the way you talk doesn't have the rules that any sort of social relationship used to have in the past.
Not only does it not only not have the rules, but it doesn't have the educational or the knowledge foundation. I mean, you're looking only at the topping on the cake. You're not understanding everything else associated with it. But again, I mean, I'm afraid to say this is now part of globalization. All of this fake news, all of this erroneous information that's out there, public comments by Trump people saying there are no longer any such things as facts. It's what people perceive to be real that is real. And
recently, everybody who was in a position to negotiate, govern, organize bureaucratically or politically had basically the same education. They all had the same basis of knowledge about the way the world works. That's no longer true. Actually, there's been articles about this in the media just the last couple of days, and I forget now where I read it, whether it was The Economist or the Financial Times or somewhere else. But it's been noticed that the people who are in positions with some influence in a number of Western countries are people who've not gone through the educational system that produced the elites of the past.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's another part of the problem. I think that when we've had a change of government in England, change of government in the US, we're going to have a change of government in
France and Italy.
France and Germany. I don't know whether we're going to change of government in Russia.
No,
not so likely, I think. But when we get through all these changes of government, things are going to be very different.
But haven't we seen this before, though, throughout history? I mean, what was the Cultural Revolution in China?
Well, that was between the mid-60s and the mid-70s, and And that was what changed China much more than the actual revolution did, and much more than the change from the empire to the republic in 1911.
But it was an attack on facts. It was an attack on the intelligentsia. It was an attack.
Well, it was disruption of social life. It was the first time anything had happened in China, and it was very clever of Mao to do it this way. And he hasn't really got the credit for it yet. That he completely disrupted the social, I'm not sure whether it's really a structure of the society, Chinese society, that had been in place since the 7th century when they introduced the examination system.
That's what I get the sense that we could be seeing the beginning of that in the Western democracies.
Yeah, well, I mean, to some extent, the wars of the first half of the last century did that to some extent. There's going to be, for England, for Great Britain to move out of Europe, there's got to be so much reorganization. And nobody realized at the time of the vote, just how much reorganization was going to be necessary, and nobody yet has any idea how to do it.
Well, the same could be said for the people who voted for Trump, who perhaps did not realize that somebody who was a proponent of the fossil fuel industry would run the EPA, or somebody who was against the minimum wage would run the Department of Labor, or a former executive from the Worldwide Wrestling Foundation would run the Small Business Administration, or a general who had believed in torture should run the Homeland Security, or the National Security Advisor should be a conspiracy theorist who believes that Hillary Clinton is chopping up babies in a pizza basement. I mean, the list is endless. And what has the vote wrought, so to speak?
I keep on remembering Margaret Thatcher saying there's no such thing as society in the 1980s.
Well, she would.
It's never actually explained, but everything that we used to think of as society is very different from what it used to be before. Simply because in all these countries that we've mentioned, everybody had a place in society which determined the way they interacted with other people and what they could do and what they couldn't do. And of course there were people manipulating the possibilities all the time, but generally it shaped everyday social life and also what happens politically. And that's not the way things are working anymore.
Well, but let me ask you a question though. All right, admittedly the public outgrowth of these political trends are anti-globalization in fact, but were not these trends caused by globalization?
In fact, it's a mistake to call them anti-globalization. They've been described in the media as being anti-globalization because they're in opposition to a lot of things that were being done, but they're really opposition to people that are in control without any awareness of the process of globalization at all. So it's people who've got left behind in the process of globalization who are now demanding more attention. And politically, presumably they're going to get more attention, but that's not going to stop the process of globalization. Well, and I think the same is pretty much everywhere, even though we haven't heard so much about it in China and Russia as in the West, but it's happening there as well.
No, I agree with that. I mean, that's why they keep such a tight lid on everything. So for exactly this reason. I mean, could you imagine if this kind of a political escapade burst into the scene in China? I mean, this would result in armed reaction by the state. Well, are you? I think we're about at the time now, aren't we?
Yes, I think we probably are.
All right. Well, we'll look forward to continuing this next week. Thank you, Professor Spooner.
Okay. Bye for now.
Bye.